And now on WRS, Michael McKay with the McKay Interview.
Hello, everyone. Communication, effective communication, has become such an important part of this bewildering, frightening and chronic COVID-19 pandemic. Governments, politicians, scientists, statisticians, physicians, nursing staff, carers of the sick and elderly, and my list is incomplete, have all come in for praise and in some cases criticism over the past few months. And communication skills, or the lack of them, in this public health and economic crisis have featured frequently in public discussion in many countries. Moreover, the media, the principal source of authoritative communication for those of us fortunate enough to live in what we call the free world, have been viewed, read, listened to, pored over more than ever, and are being judged to a higher standard more than ever before. A few weeks ago on this show, I put questions to Pierre Ritchie, president of the Geneva Press Club and the former editor-in-chief of the Tribune de Genève, about the performance of the Swiss media during this coronavirus crisis. Among other things, he highlighted the increased number listening, viewing and reading the media due to the public health crisis over the past 3 months or so. Today, I'm looking outside Switzerland and talking to a well-informed friend in the United Kingdom, but no stranger to Geneva. The English historian, journalist, author and public commentator, Professor Simon Heffer, is my guest today, the 17th of June 2020. He's published several biographies and a series of books on social history of Great Britain from the 19th century until the end of the First World War. And since 2017, he's been a professorial research fellow at the University of Buckingham in England. You can read him regularly in the Daily and Sunday Telegraphs, among other print titles, in Britain. Welcome, or should I say welcome back, to the McKay Interview, Simon. I'm sorry that we cannot meet face to face. I'm sorry for the technical cock-ups at the beginning, but under these unusual circumstances of lockdown, I guess Skype will have to do.
Well, it's nice to see you, Michael. It's like I can see you thanks to the miracle of modern technology.
Absolutely. Simon, I've too many questions for 15 minutes or so I'm going to jump straight in. In your opinion, Simon, and your long experience, what is the role of the media and what is the job of journalists and editors in the press, TV and radio during times of national crisis and seemingly chronic national anxiety like the one we're all experiencing now? Before you answer, and from the statistics that I've seen recently about the UK, you and Britain in particular are suffering more than many similar advanced economies. What's the media's role?
Well, the principal role of the media, as always, is to inform people and to tell the truth. Now, most of the information that has been coming out during this crisis has been coming from the government. So that imposes another responsibility on the media, which is to attempt to assess whether the government is telling it the truth before it relays that on to the public. I think the media also has a responsibility to be calm and sober rather than to whip up panic. And I think that we have done that reasonably well. I think we have been pretty objective and pretty responsible. I don't think we've caused any panic, at least not in this country. I think also the media does have this role of holding the government to account. There's no point in having a free press if it just acts as the patsies of the government. So there have been, certainly in Britain, a number of press articles and investigations about individual atomized matters of this pandemic, such as testing, such as the effectiveness of lockdown. But the most devastating piece I read was about 6 weeks ago, asking why there were 38 days, I think, in February and March before lockdown happened, when our Prime Minister appeared to go missing in action. He missed 5 COBRA meetings because he was away at his country residence, or one of the government's country residences. He didn't go to Chequers, he went to, I think it was Chevening in Kent, with his partner, who subsequently became the mother of his latest child. And there's going to be a public inquiry at some stage, which again the press quite rightly have been saying must happen. And a lot of what went on will come out of the public inquiry, and I think some reputations will be quite badly damaged. But while we wait for that public inquiry, one of the really important things that my trade, and I speak as a journalist rather than as a professor, can do is to ensure that the government does tell the truth, and if it doesn't, to let people know that it's not doing so.
So let's drill down a little bit more deep into that, Simon, and just broaden the discussion a little bit. Addressing your world specifically now, the United Kingdom, you're probably aware, Simon, it's not had good reports in the foreign press for its preparedness and management of the crisis, number of deaths, lack of medical equipment, treatment of the elderly in care homes, confused political leadership. I could add more. What's your assessment of the more general state of the UK at this stage of the pandemic?
Well, I mean, do you mean the United Kingdom generally, or the state of the government generally?
No, in relation to the way that the pandemic has been handled.
Well, I don't think it's been handled well. The worst of this is yet to come, not in terms of people being infected or dying, because that's clearly on the way out, but what historians will look back in years to come on as the 2020 pandemic crisis. The worst of it is going to be the next few months as we deal with the economic aftermath. We've already had reports from the newspapers today here of 600,000 people losing their jobs already. Now, we had quite low unemployment in this country compared with many European countries, but it's now rocketed up. And I don't know how easily those jobs will be restored. There are whole sectors of our economy, such as the commercial property market, which are going to be very badly affected by this. I know people who have not renewed leases on their commercial property because they say, well, their staff can work just as easily from home. If they do renew their leases, they'll be buying much smaller or leases on much smaller properties and have their staff into the office for meetings maybe once or twice a week. Otherwise, everything done from home. So we're on the verge of a great economic upheaval in this country, and the damage will only be apparent when everyone has technically gone back to work. At the moment, quite sensibly, we're saying if you can work from home, do so. I think that the lockdown actually was something that we went into too late. If we were going into it at all, we should have gone into it about 2 weeks earlier. Otherwise, we should have tried the Swedish method. When I last looked at the figures, Sweden had lower rates of death per 100,000 than we did. I think the last figure I saw was something like 56 per 100,000 in Britain and 44 per 100,000 in Sweden. And they didn't inflict this damage on their economy that we have done. So,
as you know, Simon, it's complicated by so many factors because the population density of Sweden is so much less than it is in the United Kingdom. There are so many factors in this. It's hard to know, isn't it?
Well, sure. But, you know, the last time we had a pandemic in this country was not 1918, which everybody talks about, but actually Hong Kong flu in 1968.
I remember that, yeah.
When 35,000 people died.
Yeah.
We've got, according to what figures you believe, between 41 and 50,000 people have died in this country. And we didn't close down our economy in 1968, and we just, you know, kept calm and carried on. We certainly didn't close it down in 1918.
I was going to ask you about that. Can we learn anything from 1918?
Well, I think what we can learn from 1918 is if you're in a total war situation and you can't close down your factories, you can't stop the movement of, on an average day, 50,000 troops to and from France to try and win a war, then you just have to keep going. And sadly, we lost 228,000 people in 1918. I'm not suggesting we should go to those extremes, but I think that the decision to lock everybody down, and it wasn't to save our lives, it was to save our National Health Service, suggested chronic mismanagement of the National Health Service. If the National Health Service couldn't cope with a pandemic such as this is why there's got to be a public inquiry. I don't think anybody in this country thinks that if a second wave of this were to come, say next January or February, that we could do this again, because we'd be back in the Stone Age pretty quickly. The country would be a basket case. So, you know, we took a drastic step, perhaps because it's lasted longer than it might have done because we took it so late. And, you know, we have to think about this. I think we are in a precarious, not a perilous, but a precarious state here, because I don't know how some sectors of our economy are going to, you know, be revived. Yesterday, my wife and I went out for a drive round for the first time in 3 months because the shops had reopened. We went to we drove about a 50-mile round
And
trip to a
do you
shop.
live in the city or do you live in the countryside?
Now I live in the countryside, and we live in Essex, and we went up to Suffolk and back to do some shopping because there was a specialist shop we wanted to go to. And one thing I thought as I drove round England yesterday, a beautiful day here, seeing lots of country pubs, how many of them are going to reopen? Seeing restaurants in little towns and cafes, how many of them are going to reopen? This is the real problem. We don't know how bad things are yet. It will, we've still got this 2-meter rule, which Europe mostly doesn't have, which is absurd. And brewers, for example, are saying to our government, it's cheaper for us to keep our pubs closed indefinitely than it is to reopen them, because the footfall you're going to allow will be so small.
I've got 2 more questions for you, Simon. Sorry to interrupt, but the stopwatch is rushing against me. But first of all, my guest today is Professor Simon Heffer, the well-known historian, journalist, and commentator, and he's speaking to me via Skype from England. I'm just going to go back a little bit to what you touched on at the beginning of our conversation, the role of journalists and truth. Simon, we can all benefit from your perspective as an historian and communication skills as a journalist. But give us some insights into the answers to this question. What is truth as seen through journalistic lens, and particularly when applied to accuracy in science and veracity in government? And I ask you this again with the COVID-19 pandemic uppermost in my mind. What is truth?
Well, in terms of what government says, all we can do is report exactly what the government says. It's then the job of commentators to analyse what the government has said and to decide whether or not it's true according to whatever standards the issue is that they're discussing. When you come to scientists, I think one of the obligations that we do have, and I've seen this particularly in the broadsheet press, is to suggest that actually on many of these issues in the management of this crisis, there has not been a consensus among scientists about what to be done. So I think we have a duty to say, well, one group of scientists says 2 meters, one group says 1.5 meters, and another group here says 1 meter.
So the duty is to point these differences out, you mean?
Yes, and to let people know that actually if the government is relaying scientific advice, it is relaying one strand of scientific advice, the strand that it pays for. We have a chief scientific officer, a chief medical officer. It's relaying that, and not necessarily some of the stuff that comes from other equally well qualified people working in universities and research institutes who may have a different view of this. Yeah. After all, Sweden obviously had very different scientific advice when it decided not to have a lockdown.
Last question, Simon. It's a rather long one, so forgive me. But as I have you in front of the Skype microphone and screen, I must ask you this question, although probably not enough time to give a proper answer. It's only obliquely related to COVID-19, but I'm interested to know what you think about the spate of demonstrations taking place around the world, which has brought all colours and races out onto the streets, triggered by a murderous policeman and the needless death of an African-American in Minneapolis. Thank God for iPhone cameras and social media in such cases. All wrapped tightly together with the Black Lives Matter movement, we witnessed a terrible example of police violence heaped on the already bent back of years of racial injustice in the United States, and which also, as you know, has triggered sympathetic responses in British streets, British media, British public opinion, and now topped off, to use an expression, by an unusual spate of statue toppling, statue defacement, statue reorientation of past figures like Edward Colston in Bristol, Winston Churchill, Cecil Rhodes, though he hasn't fallen yet, on the grounds of their racist, imperialist past or otherwise distasteful opinions or actions are judged through the early 20th century lens, has offended the sensibilities of some. Long question. And I also read that you're going to change some street names and towns and cities. There's a lot there intertwined, Simon, but try to untangle for me and let our listeners in a few minutes know what you think of what's going on in the United Kingdom regarding this particular issue.
Well, first of all, I think that if America wants to be considered a civilized country around, then its policemen have to behave a lot better than they are behaving. And I can quite understand why people of all colours in this country have expressed their disgust and revulsion at the fact that a policeman should put his knee on another man's neck irrespective, frankly, of the colour of that man. It's an abominable act to do against anybody for 8 minutes and 46 seconds and kill him in the process. So I find that disgusting, and I think all civilized human beings would find that disgusting. And we know that the American police have a track record of being particularly vicious when they get a black man in their hands. And I mean, I have been trying to understand not the mentality of the American policeman, because that's beyond me, but to try and understand why the police service in America, or the police force in America, is run as it is. I think there's 25,000 police forces in America.
It's almost by county, isn't it?
It is. And, you know, at some stage, there has got to be a review. If the Americans want to be taken seriously as civilized people, there's got to be a nationwide review of how the police operate. Because I think a lot of police are simply out of control. And when they see a black man, or have a black man in their hands, they just think, well, basically, you're a low form of life and I can treat you as you wish. So let's get that out of the way. It's an appalling way to behave. Mm-hmm. And I think it's incumbent on all civilized countries, particularly one like mine, which is a strong ally of America, to say this sort of behavior is disgusting. And as your ally and as a candid friend, we not only don't support it, we revile it, and you have to stop it. As for the bringing down of statues, I looked at some of the footage of those protests, both in Bristol and in London. What I saw was largely black people marching in a quiet, dignified way to protest about the disgusting treatment of another member of their race. And I saw white anarchists going around smashing up things. One white anarchist threw a policewoman off a horse and punctured her lung. All the police were trying to do was maintain order. I'm afraid that these demonstrations, certainly in my country and I think abroad, have been hijacked by people who I'm sure are sincere in their loathing of racism, but who see it as an opportunity to attack the establishment. The Antifa movement in America quite openly says, not only does it abominate the Republican Party, with Donald Trump leading it, that's quite an easy thing to do, but it also abominates the Democratic Party. So they just think the existing system has to be torn up and started again. Well, they may be right. I'm not an American. I don't have a dog in that fight in that sense. But it suggests that they are effectively anarchists. So I think I'm alarmed that some people in politics here have been very craven about this and have said, oh, well, if this very small violent minority says this, then we've got to signal our virtue and support them. It's one thing to signal your virtue, or actually just your basic human decency, and say that, you know, all men are created equal, and indeed women are created equal, and they should be treated as such. It's another thing to hijack that and use it to further political aims that go far beyond combating racism. I think every civilized person in the world thinks racism is a disgusting thing. But I'm afraid I don't take my own disapproval of racism to the extent where I want to see anarchy take over instead. And I think it's important in the public mind that those two things, which are very distinct in my view, remain distinct. As for the taking down of statues...
Yes, just briefly on that, because that interests me, what you think about taking down statues that...
Well, you can't undo or falsify your history. People in my country, hundreds of years ago, behaved in a way that we now quite rightly find disgusting. Again, there is no civilized person in the world who can make a case for slavery. It is appalling. Now, Colston in Bristol made a vast amount of money out of slavery. He also gave a vast amount of money to Bristol. So Bristol either tears down the Colston Hall. It's not good enough to take the name off it. They tear it down and start again and get another philanthropist. They wipe Colston off the face of the earth. Or, in terms of his hall and his statue and his other beneficences to the city of Bristol, they put plaques up saying, he gave us this money, this is this man, he is a key figure in this city's history, but by our standards, he was appalling. He was abominable. He was a slaver. He made money out of death and human misery and enslavement. So, he's somebody we find disgusting. I would, as a historian, clearly, I would much rather that happened. Of course, I can understand if I were a black man seeing a picture of this exploiter of my people in a public place in Bristol. I can understand it would revolt me. It would revolt me a lot less if there was a board next to it saying just what a shocking man he was, and to just say that he's a man from our history.
And do you think this will begin to happen? Sorry, go on, finish.
Well, you can't undo your history. And I know that the Mayor of London, Sadiq Khan, wants to have a review of statues. I, as a historian, could make a case for taking down virtually every statue in London put up before about 1970.
Cromwell outside the Houses of Parliament, for example. The Irish have a view on that.
Yeah, I mean, you could tear Cromwell down because of what he did to the Irish. You could take George V down, who was just outside Westminster Abbey, for having gone to the Delhi Durbar and lorded it over his Indian subjects, many of whom, through no desire of theirs, were subjects of the British Empire. Where do you stop? All the way down Whitehall, there are statues of people who engaged in colonial wars, who were heroes. Do we take them all down? Do we take Nelson off his column? Nelson, I mean, Michael, you as a man of West Indian heritage will know that Nelson did some pretty terrible things as a junior officer in naval raids in the West Indies.
He was a young officer in Kingston, Jamaica, in Port Royal.
Indeed. And he willingly bought into the whole colonial project. Do we take him off his column? Do we rename Trafalgar Square? Do we rename Victoria Station because of the behaviour of Queen Victoria?
But not to put words in your mouth, Simon, do you think there's a renewed role for the way museums behave as a historian? I mean, could you imagine over the next 5-10 years that museums start to look at these things differently for the sake of the young people growing up and educate them? Because from what I read, history isn't taught that extensively in a lot of schools in the United Kingdom. It doesn't go back that far.
History is very badly taught in schools here. All I can say is that I am almost 60 years old. I went to school in the 1960s and 70s. No one ever taught me that slavery was a good thing. We were quite well brought up morally. We knew there were statues out there, but we knew that if you study history at any level, you understand that most human beings from the past are, to use a metaphor, a game of two halves. All of us do good things and bad things. Some of the bad things people did in the past and still got statues were pretty bad. Colston QV. Will museums have a different role? I've always regarded museums as places of education rather than places of, aesthetic appreciation. And I think it's important that museums do have interpretative material there to tell you, what you're looking at, but also statues out in public. All I would ask is that the historians who are asked to write the material that goes in leaflets or on boards or on video representations of these things do so in a fair-minded way. And this means not having a committee of historians who are all basically in support of the anarchist movement, but having a cross-section of historians who can say, can truly say there are two sides to every story. Some of the sides, again, with Colston, might be, not equal to the enormities that these people carried out. Nonetheless, they need to be there.
Simon, we have to leave it there. My stopwatch has raced in front of me. Thanks so much for answering all my questions. I really wish I had more time to talk. Maybe we do another program on that on another occasion. My guest today has been Professor Simon Heffer of the University of Buckingham in the United Kingdom. Thanks again, Simon. Great to see you.
Thank you, Michael. Nice to talk to you.
That was the McKay Interview with Michael McKay. And don't forget, you can hear that interview again on our website, worldradio.ch.